At least once a week, I find myself saying something which probably for a rabbi is quite strange, which is, wow, am I relieved that I'm not a Zoroastrian. Now, that might be a strange thing to say, but the reason why it's such a common refrain in my household is because it's kind of a running joke that I am ridiculously bad with fire. I'm bad at lighting fires, I'm bad at keeping fires lit. Usually takes about 6 matches to get a fire started, and I have to be a little careful if I walk past a candle, because it seems to just go out. My wife is excellent with fire. She clearly has a natural affinity for it, which is a little bit terrifying. But me, I don't. And one of the things that I comfort myself with is being grateful that in fact I'm not a priest of the Zoroastrian religion, but a rabbi in the Jewish religion. Now, the reason is, of course, because Zoroastrianism, an ancient faith which actually influenced Judaism quite a bit, is a religion which worships fire, or rather, worships God through the symbol of fire. Many Zoroastrian temples contain a perpetual fire, which is tended by the priests, and sometimes which has been lit for hundreds of years. One of the most famous ones in India has a fire which has been going continuously for something like 900 years. The priests who live in the temple tend the fire, and pilgrims come to visit it to see this fire which has been going for so long. It's a symbol of God in the Zoroastrian faith, and it makes sense. It's also a symbol of God in our faith. And in particular, this week, in Parashat Ekev, we read a description of God which really strikes me as strange. In the beginning of chapter 9, God is described by Moses as an esh ochla, usually translated as a consuming fire. Ochel is to eat. So really it's a fire which consumes, quite literally. It's a fire which eats things up, which burns through things. And the reason this stands out is not just because it's maybe a strange image to be using, but especially because it's directly contradictory to one of the most central images of how we see God, which is the burning bush. All the way back in Exodus, when God appears to Moses out in the desert at the burning bush, the emphasis is on the fact that the bush is burning, but not consumed. The words themselves are V'hasnei einenu ukal. The bush was not consumed. And actually, that's the exact same language. It was not uchal, consumed in Exodus. And here in Deuteronomy, God is a esh ochla, a consuming fire. It strikes me that this dichotomy is quite significant, partially because it shows us how different Deuteronomy is from the other books of the Torah. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, they have an image of God which is very hard to pin down. God is something which changes names, which often is understood in different ways. The idea of monotheism, which we retroactively apply to the Torah, doesn't make as much sense when you look at Genesis and Exodus, where God much more resembles the polytheistic mythologies of the other cultures of the ancient Near East. But Deuteronomy is different. Deuteronomy lays the groundwork for this idea of God in a monotheistic sense as we come to understand it. God, which is our God and the only God. God, which is a consuming fire who calls us to vengeance and violence. And it's that link, actually, between the rather simplistic monotheism of Deuteronomy and violence, which I find particularly difficult. The God that appears in Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, not in that order, not always necessarily a very peaceful God, to be fair. There's lots of violence in all of those books. But there's more complexity. God shows compassion, often, and God can be compelled to show compassion. Many times Moses negotiates or coerces God to be compassionate and kind and loving. And actually the image of God as a simple, burning, consuming, violent entity is not really present until we get to Deuteronomy. I think it also reflects two different views of how we understand religion and faith. The consuming fire is a powerful image. It's active. It's something which is ongoing, but actually time-limited. A consuming fire will eat up the fuel it can find, and then it will burn away. Whereas the alternate image, the image of the unburned bush, is one of perpetual light, perpetual fire, a fire which burns and burns and burns without ever actually changing the substance that is burning. I think, to be oversimplistic about it, these are two different understandings of what God is to us that we have to reckon with as people who have inherited all 5 books of the Torah. We have to try and understand which one speaks to us. And to me, the image of the Eish Ochla, of the consuming fire of God that we read this week, doesn't speak to me. I find it unnerving that God could be described as something which burns up fuel, which is connected so deeply to the passionate narrative in this week's Parashah about the violence the Israelites will need to use when they conquer the land they're about to inhabit. I much prefer the depiction of God in Exodus as the bush which is not consumed. It's passive, and it's perpetual. Like the fire in those Zoroastrian temples, that fire is there all the time. And that's what makes it powerful. Not its potency, but its persistence. We have a really important symbol of that we often don't even notice in our own communities, which is the Ner Tamid, the perpetual light. Now, here at Sam's, that's a light bulb. But it's a light bulb which is on all the time. Health and safety isn't so keen on the idea of an oil-burning fire all the time. But in more ancient synagogues, that was the case. Just like a Zoroastrian temple, there was an oil-burning fire all the time. That's what the Ner Tamid was. A perpetual light, a perpetual fire, a perpetual symbol of God's persistence. And what's really powerful is that right now, when actually for the last 4 months very little has been happening in the synagogue building, now that things are starting to again, and we walk in, and we look at the room in which we pray and we read the Torah, and we see hanging or depicted or shining that Ner Tamid, in our case that light bulb, it should remind us actually of the image of God as the unconsumed burning bush. Because while nothing has been going on in this building for some time, that light has been shining every day. When every other light was out, when no one was here, that light bulb was on. And remains on, and will remain on, at least until it burns out. We need to change it. The practicalities aside, the symbol is a potent one, and I think one that should make us pause when we get to Deuteronomy, and when we get to the language that Moses employs of depicting God as a consuming fire, because actually the God in which we cherish most is not consuming fire, but perpetual fire. And particularly now, we can do with appreciating that image of persistence, and that even when everything else changes, a light continues and carries on. It may be quite different in some ways from the fire tended in Zoroastrian temples by its priests, and I'm certainly grateful that my job doesn't entail tending to the fire which burns perpetually here, but the symbol is the same. And the idea is one that we can really use, especially now, when in the darkness, we can use the reminder of the fact that there's a light which always shines and is always there. Shabbat Shalom.